Hey everyone, time for another video. Back in August of 2008, Nvidia released the 9400 GT, a DirectX 10 capable card intended for the budget segment of the market, which also supported OpenGL 3.3 and OpenCL 1.1, and supported monitors that used either DVI or VGA connectors. It came in a variety of memory configurations, which were 128MB, 256MB, 512MB, and the version which we have here today, which has 1GB of DDR2 memory. Based on the Tesla architecture, using a cut-down version of the G96 GPU that you'll have found in the 9500 GT, the 9400 GT had a core clock of 550MHz, with a shader clock of 1400MHz, and a memory clock of 400MHz, which is effectively 800MHz with it being DDR2 memory. It featured 314 million transistors, built on the 55nm fabrication process, and it also had versions which were built on the 65nm fabrication process as well. The 9400 GT had 16 shading units, 6 texture mapping units, 4 raster operations pipelines, and 1 streaming multiprocessor, and a TDP of only 50 watts. Nvidia do however recommend a minimum 300 watt power supply, although you'll most likely get away with using a weaker one than that, considering that there are no external PCIe power connectors. I couldn't seem to find the exact pricing for the 1GB version of this card, but originally you could pick up the 512MB version for around $59, which is roughly $69.06 today, adjusting for inflation, which is also £53.27, or €59.05 today. However, from CEX here in the UK, you can buy the 1GB version for as little as £8, which is around $10.39, or €8.88. But even at this price point, there are much faster alternatives that will give you much more performance than this can. The rest of the system I'll be using today features an i7 6700K at 4.8 GHz, with a 4.9 GHz boost on 2 cores, an MSI Z270 SLI Plus motherboard, 16GB of Corsair Vengeance DDR4 RAM at 2800MHz, and Windows 10 Pro 64-bit. First up for the games today is Grand Theft Auto 5, a game which originally released on the PS3 and Xbox 360, and finally had its much anticipated PC release in April of 2015. It is a game that is based in the fictional US state of San Andreas, which itself is based on Southern California, and centres around the lives of Michael, Trevor and Franklin. A card such as the 9400 GT has no chance of running this at 1080p. I did however set it to run to 720p using the lowest settings possible, with frame scaling set to 50%, and even though the game was effectively rendering at a resolution of only 640 by 360, the card still struggled quite a bit. Throughout the city, the FPS only managed to get to around the high teens to the mid-20s. The game also exhibited a fair amount of input lag, roughly half a second, and the inputs also locked up here as well, making vehicles near impossible to drive. The game is pretty much unplayable, even out in the desert area where FPS figures didn't really reach 30 frames per second at all. And as you can see, a Fraps benchmark showed an average of only 26 frames per second, with 1% and 0.1% lows of 19 and 16 frames per second respectively. And looking at the frame time graph on screen now, it shows that there were occasions in which there was as much as 180 milliseconds between some of the frames, which you would see as stutter throughout the game. Next up today is a game that I can't believe I'd actually never played before until a few weeks ago. It's Skyrim, or more specifically the original version, which released back in 2011, not the remaster version. I'll be running it at 720p on the lowest settings possible for the test today, with depth of field disabled through the INI file. This was another fairly bad showing for the 9400 GT, with FPS figures not getting any higher than the low to high 20s range, and much like Grand Theft Auto 5, there was also some pretty severe input lag, which made it extremely difficult to actually control your character. The performance got even worse when going indoors, as the FPS here dropped below 20, making for some pretty jarring gameplay, as if it wasn't already bad enough. And although FPS on occasions creeped above 30 frames per second, the game was completely unplayable in this state, with an average of 27 frames per second and 1% and 0.1% lows of 15 and 9 frames per second respectively. The frame time graph on screen now shows that the game was pretty stuttery throughout, with gaps between frames often going over 200 milliseconds. Moving on from Skyrim, and the next game in our test today is CSGO, or Counter-Strike Global Offensive, which I'll test in a competitive practice match on the Nuke map against hard difficulty bots. And considering the trouble I had with Grand Theft Auto 5 and Skyrim, I turned this game down to the lowest resolution that the options would allow me to, 640 by 480, and I also used the lowest settings possible. This fortunately made the game mostly bearable, putting aside the fact that it was often quite hard to see what was going on due to the low resolution. Performance-wise though, the game pretty much stuck between 30 to 60 frames per second throughout the test, and on occasion reached into the 80s, and didn't seem to show any stutter at all, at least none that I noticed during gameplay. Overall, the game managed an average of 53 frames per second, with 1% and 0.1% lows of 28 and 25 frames per second respectively, which along with the frame time graph on screen now, shows that the game did in fact dip below 30 FPS at points, but as I said, the stutter wasn't noticeable at all, and overall was perfectly playable if this is all you can manage. The last game for today before I move on to overclocking is Fortnite Battle Royale, a game in which you face off against 99 other players in a battle to the death with the last man or woman standing declared the winner. Fortnite was by far the worst game performance-wise that I tested on the 9400 GT. It shows 720p with the lowest settings apart from view distance, which I set to epic. I also set the frame scaling to 50%, meaning that the game, much like GTA 5, was actually running at a resolution of only 640 by 360, and even at settings as low as this, FPS in the pre-match holding area dipped as low as 6 frames per second, with fairly severe input lag, and the FPS tended to sit around 9 up to the high teens. Moving on to the battle bus was no better. FPS here only managed to get to about 18 frames per second, and sat around 10 frames per second for the most part. During diving, the FPS dropped even lower, with figures as low as 9 being observed. Once on the ground, performance yet again dropped even further, and the FPS was constantly in the single figures. Combat was completely impossible due to the input lag, and overall, the game is a complete no-go on the 9400 GT, with an average of 13 frames per second, which was inflated slightly by the time spent in the loading screens, and 1% and 0.1% lows of 6 and 4 frames per second respectively. The frame time graph also shows multiple occasions where there were gaps of more than 1 second between frames, further showing just how badly this game runs on the 9400 GT. Overclocking wise on the 9400 GT, you can overclock the core, the memory and the shader clock as well. However, if you're on Windows 10, you'll have to use EVGA Precision version 2.1.2, if you can even find it, to unlink the shader clock from the core clock and overclock it independently. I just used MSI Afterburner as I experienced instability when overclocking the shader separately. I did however manage to get a stable 660 MHz on the core, which put the shader clock at around 1700 MHz. I also managed to achieve 450 MHz on the memory, which is effectively 900 MHz with it being DDR2. From what I read on some online forums, I wasn't really expecting the overclock to make much of a difference at all, and in some regards that was correct, but with Grand Theft Auto 5 it pretty much fixed the insane amount of input lag that the stock clocks exhibited, and bumped up the FPS to semi-playable levels. Performance in the city still wasn't great, with FPS figures in the low to high 20s, with some dips into the high teens, and out in the desert FPS managed to stay around the high 20s to mid 30s, which was pretty much the same for the game as a whole, which showed an average of 31 frames per second, with 1% and 0.1% lows of 23 and 21 frames per second respectively. Although, as the frame time graph shows, the game was underneath 30 frames per second quite a lot. Moving on to Skyrim, and like GTA 5, the overclock managed to fix the input lag that I experienced at stock speeds. The FPS was still quite often underneath 30 frames per second, but was a massive improvement in terms of playability over stock. FPS throughout the game tended to stay in the high 20s to around the mid 30s range, and on occasion managed to reach over 40 frames per second, making for some relatively smooth gameplay compared to earlier. There were however still some parts of the game that were pretty jarring to play through, such as indoor areas in which the FPS dropped as low as the high teens. An average of 31 frames per second was observed, with 1% and 0.1% lows of 17 and 13 frames per second respectively, and taking a look at the frame time graph shows that there was some stutter throughout the game as well, with several occasions where the gaps in frame times were over 1/10 of a second. Now we move on to CSGO, and we're sticking to the same map and match mode that we used for the stock gameplay, with the same 640 by 480 resolution and low settings. The game is already reasonably playable at stock speeds, and nothing much changed with an overclock, other than having slightly better average and 1% low frame rates, and overall the game, much like stock, was a pretty playable experience if you can put up with the low resolution. With the overclock, the 9400 GT managed an average of 59 frames per second, with 1% and 0.1% lows of 33 and 26 frames per second respectively. The 0.1% low of 26 frames per second, along with the frame time graph on screen now, show that at times the game did in fact dip underneath 30 frames per second, but fortunately I didn't notice the dips at any point during the test. And lastly for the games today, we move on to Fortnite, which unfortunately showed pretty much no improvement at all, and ran just as badly as it did at stock. FPS in the pre-match holding area still dropped underneath 10 frames per second, and never really managed to get higher in the high teens. FPS was pretty much the same as it was at stock when on the battle bus and during diving as well. During gameplay after you land on the ground, the game was still pretty much impossible to play, with FPS figures hitting as low as 5 frames per second, leaving you to get killed before you even have a chance to actually see what is happening on screen. The Fraps benchmark showed an average of 14 frames per second, with 1% and 0.1% lows of 6 and 5 frames per second respectively. The frame time graph again shows multiple occasions in which the gaps between frames were over half a second, with some reaching upwards of 0.8 of a second as well. Overall, I wasn't really expecting much from the 9400 GT, with it being a card meant for the budget segment of the market when it was released 10 years ago, but I was still quite surprised at just how badly some of the games performed at resolutions as low as 640 by 360, namely Fortnite, which to be honest I had expected to be the best performer during my test, given that it has more simplistic graphics than the others. I had also expected Skyrim to perform better than it did as well, with it being released only 3 years after the 9400 GT was, but that unfortunately was a truly awful experience at stock. If you liked this video, please consider liking and sharing it, or maybe even leaving a comment as well. You could also subscribe to my channel if you'd like to see more content like this. Thanks for watching, and hopefully you'll tune in for the next one.